welcome to Black Literature, Black History. My name is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to get into the first three sections of the book called The Big C, which is the first autobiography of Langston Hughes. But before we get into that book, I want to address a few things. Like in Black culture today, we like to look back and say, well, our elders didn't teach us what we needed to know to move forward. That's why we don't know our history. They didn't teach us our history like other cultures teach their children and their descendants their history as they move on through life. And I find that that's not true. Our ancestors wrote down many of their stories. They showed the truth of what went on in American history. However, our schools don't teach it. Now, we may be at fault for hoping that our schools would teach us our own history, but in America, they don't want to teach us our own history for a few reasons. One of the reasons I believe that kindergarten through 12th grade and then undergrad and college, they don't teach us our history is because, number one, the teachers that are teaching in our schools don't know our history. They weren't interested in it. They're not Black. They don't know anything about Black culture except for what they see on TV and things that interest them, which is part of what the Harlem Renaissance, quote, Harlem Renaissance is about, is because when people are interested in Black culture, they're interested in the music, the partying, the alcohol, the sex, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's all they're interested in. They're not interested in what's going on in the household, what's going on outside of the cabarets, and what's going on while you're looking for work and things of that nature. And they weren't even interested back then, and why would you think that they're interested in it now? I have another video, which is a letter written by Zora Neale Hurston, where she talks about what white liberals are interested in involving themselves in the Black struggle. And they think they have answers to our problems when they don't really understand what our problems are. However, our problems are addressed in autobiographies like Langston Hughes. Our problems are addressed in autobiographies like the autobiography of Malcolm X. We have a lot of very true autobiographies, and this autobiography, The Big C, is a very good autobiography of Langston Hughes. And you'll notice that in reading this, he doesn't get too much into his feelings when he's encountering a few issues. There's a couple times in the book where he tells how he feels about certain things that are going on in his life. However, much of this book is a description of his experiences. And I think maybe one of the reasons why he doesn't get too much into his feelings is because Langston Hughes was more interested in showing people the reality in which he lived rather than about him. And that was one of the complaints about the book when he wrote it, and I'm going to read a section in the introduction, was that there wasn't enough about himself, more as he liked to describe the time period in which he lived and what everyone was going through. And they asked him to take that part out of the book, but he left it in there. And I'm going to read you that section. So, our ancestors wrote down what we need to know about Black history that we can take, learn, internalize, and move forward, which will help us handle our problems that we encounter, make us have discussions that need to be had instead of continuing back and forth with the same discussion. That's a good reason why I'm teaching this autobiography. I'm going to point out discussions that they had back then in Black culture that we're still having today and haven't moved on. And this was written back in, the book was written in the 1940s. But the time period that he's writing about is the 1920s and prior to that. So he goes all the way back to his childhood. So getting into the book, in the introduction, they asked Langston Hughes to write his autobiography. At first, he refused to write it when they first asked him, because he was in his mid-20s when they asked him to write it. And he said, I'm still too much involved in the making of history. Like, he was too involved in the Harlem invasions, which is now called the Harlem Renaissance. He was too much involved in it to write a book about his life, because he was still living his life. And then later in his 30s, he decided to sit down and write the first half of his autobiography, The Big C. And after he finished writing it, or as he was writing it and sending in his drafts, they complain about what you're writing. First, they ask you to write something, you write it, then they complain about what you're writing because you're not writing what they want you to write. And when you're writing a book back in this time period, one of your goals is always to have some type of appeal to the white audience, because at this time period, the white people were the one buying the books. However, with that being said, Langston Hughes wanted to always be true to his black audience, so he did have pushback and ultimately wrote in this book what he wanted to write about in this book. So in the introduction on Roman numeral 15, it reads, his loving sense of a black audience led to problems from the start. When Blanche Knopf read the first draft of The Big C, she found tedious the long Harlem Renaissance section that comprises the second half of the book. It was too full of Carl Van Vechten, Wallace Thurman, Jean Toomer, and so on, until it became a sort of Harlem cavalcade, which is wrong. In response, he vigorously defended the details of Harlem life as the background against which I moved and developed as a writer, and from which much of the material of my stories and poems came. No doubt, some small portions of it may have vital meaning to only my own people, but these portions would add to the final integrity and truth of the work as a whole. I am trying to write a truthful and honest book. Black readers would certainly give me a raising if I only wrote about sailors, Paris nightclubs, etc., and didn't put something cultural in the book. All the material is not there for that reason, but because it was a part of my life. And the fault lies in the writing if I had not made it live. Largely at the insistence of Van Vechten, almost all the cuts were restored. Langston was the last historian of that period who knows anything about it, Van Vechten declared, in urging Hughes to expand rather than trim the section, which is now generally recognized as the finest first-hand account of the Harlem Renaissance in existence. But Hughes's attempt to reach the black reader went further than such sections. So Langston Hughes wrote this book for the black audience and also the white audience, but he wanted to make sure that he reaches the black audience. Now, I said in some of my earlier videos to check the integrity of whatever it is you're reading. You want to know who the writer is, what message is being sent, and the author and the audience that the message is being sent to, or what the book is being written, who the book is being written for. So the author, you got Langston Hughes, the message being sent, his autobiography, which he said that he needed to keep in sections that they wanted to take out that reached the black audience. He said it may only be cultural and have meaning for my people, but that adds to the integrity of the book. And then the audience was everyone, the black audience and the white audience as well. And he said that he needed the parts of the Harlem and different sections in the book because that is where you can find many elements from his autobiography in his writings. And from reading his writings, like The Ways of White Folks, you'll notice that in his autobiography, Langston Hughes doesn't put a lot of feeling into his writing. There's not a lot of descriptions of how he felt. He doesn't get in his feelings when he encounters certain situations and racism and things like that. He looks at it. A lot of times he casts a humorous, uh, just a humorous coat on it and moves on because he sees many things in racism that just are utterly stupid. And instead of crying about it, he just laughs about it. But there's not many feelings in his autobiography. However, you do see elements from his autobiography that are in his book, The Ways of White Folks. And when we looked at The Ways of White Folks, you saw that there was a lot of feeling going on in that book. There was a lot of suffering, a lot of, he would set the tone of the stories with what was going on at that time. So it seems to me like his autobiography is just an account of what he was going through and what he's seen, but his writings is where he expresses his feelings. As a poet and as a storyteller, he shows his feelings. Now, for example, we read in The Ways of White Folks about father and son, where the father was Colonel Norwood. And in this book, he starts out at age 21. The very first chapter is called 21, and he's discussing the people that he was riding on a boat with. I want to get back to this before I get into the relationship to a father and son, but it starts out with one thing that the black community needs to talk about. In 21, Langston Hughes is turning 21, and he talks about throwing all of his books overseas because he was really into books. And as you read through the autobiography, he goes full circle from the time that he throws these books overseas, overboard, to what was going on and why he did it. Because you would think like, man, he's a writer, he's a poet, he's all about literature. Why is he throwing his books over the edge of the boat at the beginning of his autobiography? Which captures your interest, so he did that on purpose. But notice that he's on a boat, steamship that he works on, and he's going overseas. They're headed to Africa. And the black community needs to travel. Black people need to travel. You need to spend some time outside of the United States, outside of your state, outside of the United States. You can encounter other cultures who don't have the same discourse that the United States has. You need to experience countries that don't have the same history of slavery, that don't have the same history as Jim Crow and Reconstruction and segregation and things like that. And you need to travel to countries that have had similar discourses in their history. For example, in his second autobiography, I Wonder as I Wonder, you'll see that there were some similar situations in the Soviet Union and in Russia that had segregation. Everything was segregated prior to Langston Hughes' arrival, and he sees that with the arrival of communism, which is in theory is supposed to make everything equal, the only power being the government, which divides everything equal among the people. He saw that this segregation among people was removed, and he admired that, and that's the reason why many of the black people in the U.S. were communists, card-carrying communists. And from the other videos that I wrote about the Camp Hill shootings and the Scottsboro Boys, you saw Russians and communists actually making tangible contributions to the black community. Black people like to ask the question, which is a legitimate question, what have you done for black people? why should I support you? And they have reasons. From the Camp Hill shootings, the Scottsboro boys were two occasions, and there's many other occasions where the Communist Party was, in fact, supporting the black community, not because they were just black, because it was about labor and the working class and a fight against capitalism. So while in this description of his friends on the boat while they were traveling to Africa, Langston Hughes points out that, here it is, I'll read this little section about his friend George from Kentucky. George was from Kentucky. He had worked around racehorses and spoke of several white gentlemen out of his past as Colonel. We were all about the same age, George, Rahman, and I. So it said he spoke of several white gentlemen out of his past as Colonel. And we know that Colonel Norwood was addressed in father and son. And as I explained, if you were in high school and you were reading this autobiography, your teacher will be forced to tell you the reason why in history we had to refer to white men as colonel, captain, private, and things like that when they're not in the military. Was because of the militias that were set in place to oppress black people. The Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, was written for white male landowners to keep their property intact and to keep their slaves and to keep black people in line. And that went from slavery onward. This was written way past time of slavery. I don't want to say way past time of slavery because we're still not way past slavery now, but this was written after slavery, many years after slavery, and people were still referring to white people as colonel, captain, military names because of these militias that they had in place. And when we get to The Marrow of Tradition by C.W. Chestnut, we're going to read about a particular race riot that occurred where white people attacked black people with these militias that they had in place. So that's one occasion that Langston Hughes makes a reference in the ways of white folks to things that went on in his life. And some other things that I want to read is, here's some other issues that they might have to cover if they were going to read autobiographies. And the struggle of black people was not always the big events that go on, the civil rights movement, the civil rights marches, and just the big events that folks look at. The change occurs from little small acts of civil rights. And here's an act that you would never have heard of if you didn't read this book, was when Langston Hughes was going to a school and they didn't want him at a white school. They wanted to send him to a colored school, but his mother wasn't having it. So I'm going to read this section. At first, they did not want to admit me to the school because there were no other colored families living in that neighborhood. They wanted to send me to the colored school blocks away down across the railroad tracks. But my mother, who was always ready to do battle for the rights of a free people, went directly to the school board and finally got me into the Harrison Street School, where all the teachers were nice to me except the ones who sometimes used to make remarks about my being colored. And after such remarks, occasionally the kids would grab stones and tin cans out of the alley and chase me home. And I want to continue because I'm going to make a point about what's going on in the second paragraph. But there was one little white boy who would always take up for me. Sometimes others of my classmates would as well. So I learned early not to hate all white people. And ever since, it has seemed to me that most people are generally good in every race and in every country where I have been. So there, like Langston Hughes is very good at writing very simple, very direct, however covering like very deep issues. Like he said, he learned early in life not to hate all white people, and that's very deep to say something like that. And he said in his travels through different countries, he learned that most people generally are good. Now, why is this so deep? This is so deep because people don't understand, unless you're black and have lived in the US, that many of our encounters with other races in the US, particularly the white race, many of our encounters are very negative. They don't understand that when you live in poverty, or if you're living in the working class, and when your family has problems, the police that are coming to your house to resolve these problems are white men, for the most part, white people. The family services that are coming to your house to take care of problems that are going on in the household, generally at this time period and even today, are white people. The people who are breaking up your families, taking you to foster care, or taking you away from things that you're familiar with, are white people. When you have encounters with other types of white people, the negative encounters, you're reading on the news about they want to keep the Confederate flag and all of these things. When I was younger, I had a lot of encounters with white people. I've been called nigger and everything since I was a little child. And some people nowadays, they can remember the first time that they were called nigger, but I grew up in Northeast Ohio. I can't remember the first time because I grew up in it. And I'm very fair-skinned, which there's something that he covers, mentions briefly in the second chapter that we get in about different levels of blackness, where he goes into his history. But, you know, like, many encounters with white people are negative if you're black. And in the autobiography of Malcolm X addresses that when he was in the Nation of Islam and he was calling white men devil, when he looked back on his history, he could justify the reason why he was calling white people devil. He said it was white people who he believed killed his father. He said it was white people who split up his family when his mother was having breakdowns. And when he was involved in his life of crime, it was white people that were all corrupt. And when prior to that, when he was in school, which also happened to Langston Hughes, where he said he was getting chased home by white kids throwing rocks and tin cans at him. And then there's another section where he talks about coming home black and blue because he he went into the wrong part of town. But Langston Hughes, Langston Hughes, that's happened to him, but Malcolm X talks about that's why he called white people devils, because during his life, growing up in the US, all of his encounters that brought grief and struggle and suffering in his life were at the hands of white people. So it's very deep that Langston Hughes says that he learned early not to hate all white people. And then he goes on to say that generally most people are good through his travels. And what is the saying? In order for evil to prevail is when good men do nothing. Like, many people are generally good, but many people don't fight to overcome the struggles of other races, which is something that Malcolm X addressed in his autobiography. He said that if you are not actively fighting against racism that was set up, when he was talking to white people, he said if you're not actively fighting against the racism and the system that your forefathers set up for you to have an advantage in this life, then you are just as racist as them who set up that system, because you're taking advantage of it. And you need to acknowledge that. Many of them don't want to acknowledge it. They just want to live their life and say, well, that stuff happened back then. It's not my fault. That was their fault. And want to move on and tell you to get over it while you're still struggling to get over what was set up during the forefathers and the ancestor times. And Langston Hughes is giving us the truth, and he's talking about it right here, where they didn't want him to go to the school, and his mother had to fight to keep him in the school. And these little struggles like that were happening all over the United States help Black people get the rights that they have today. And then another section, what I want to get into is, yes, Langston Hughes, he has a lot of militant prose in his book, and it comes, when you read about his background, he talks about his grandmother. Through my grandmother's stories, always life moved heroically toward an end. Nobody ever cried at my grandmother's stories. They worked or schemed or fought, but no crying. When my grandmother died, I didn't cry either. Something about my grandmother's stories, without her ever having said so, taught me the uselessness of crying about anything. She was a proud woman, gentle, but Indian and proud. I remember once she took me to Osawatomie, where she was honored by President Roosevelt Teddy, and sat on the platform with him while he made a speech, for she was the last surviving widow of John Brown's raid. There, another element in an autobiography that our teachers would be forced to discuss with the class if we were reading this. What was John Brown's raid? John Brown was a white man, and I believe his raid was on Harper's Ferry. It was a slave revolt led by a white man, very violent, very bloody. Langston Hughes goes on to discuss that. He didn't go into the raid and what happened. However, he talks about his grandmother's husband going off on the raid. She didn't know that he was going to the raid, but he left, never returned. However, her husband's clothes was returned to her full of bullet holes. See, Langston Hughes just keeps it real. His clothes was returned to her full of bullet holes because her husband participated in John Brown's raid back in the day. So Langston Hughes, his grandmother, and prior to that, he's not that far removed from slavery. You need to understand this. Like, slavery wasn't that long ago. I have slave paper in my family, and it only goes back 5 generations. 5, and when I call generations, just 5 lifetimes. Like, just, your great-grandmother, your great-grandmother's great-grandmother's grandmother, like that. So slavery is not that long ago. Langston Hughes' grandmother was married to a man who, she was the last surviving widow of John Brown's raid. So this is a very necessary autobiography to read because Langston Hughes heard those stories directly from his grandmother. And he put those in these books so that we can know about it. Now, an interesting section prior to that, writing about that, the section is called Negro. And it's when he was on the steamboat and he actually arrived to Africa. He really wanted to go to Africa. He's a Negro going to Africa. And the first thing that he writes when he got to Africa, he said, "But there's one thing that hurt me a lot when I talked with the people. The Africans looked at me and would not believe I was a Negro. You see, unfortunately, I am not black. There are lots of different kinds of blood in our family, but here in the United States, the word Negro is used to mean anyone who has any Negro blood at all in his veins. In Africa, the word is more pure. It means all Negro, therefore black." So in the black community now and prior, there are discussions about who's black, who's not black, are biracial people black, or opera rooms and things like that. Mulattoes are they black, which evidently are leaders in the community and people who are really involved in the struggle. They don't talk about that because it's not an issue. If you're not supporting all of your people, then you don't need to support any of your people, because you can't be trusted for certain tasks that may be called upon you, because you're trying to make decisions on what you want to do and what you want to support based on the skin tone of fellow black people. I don't never hear Louis Farrakhan talking about that. I never heard Malcolm X talking about that. I never heard Martin Luther King talk about that. I never heard Marcus Garvey talk about that. Langston Hughes just mentions it here, but he uses this as a background to drop into his own history, because after that he started to go into his history, but it's not addressed in this and any of the writers that we're going to read about in this background. Even the slave narratives, they talked about different colors of people and some different treatments. Maybe I'm trying to think about it in the slave narratives that I've read, but I can't recall any of them who are actually involved in it, setting forth these discussions. A lot of historians who have different agendas, as we're new historicists, and we know that when you write about history, it's still the same as, fiction and autobiographies and nonfiction is all text, because the historian has an agenda. The historian is putting his experiences and what he's going through in life in whatever it is that he's writing about. But historians write about, house Negroes and field Negroes and things like that, and some separations. And then I read just recently something about the Willie Lynch letter, which black people just need to discard and never mention ever again, because the letter was fake. So we're not even going to get into that. However, so he got to Africa, found out that he wasn't black, and as far as discussing different levels of blackness, that's all that he goes. That's as far as it goes, because back then it wasn't an issue. He just made the statement, plain and simple. Here in the United States, the word Negro is used to mean anyone who has any Negro blood at all in his veins, and that's what he followed. In one of my other videos, I talk about passing. And I mentioned C.W. Chestnut. C.W. Chestnut was a writer who also lived part of his life, if I'm not mistaken, passing. He's had the experience of passing as white, because he looked like a white man. And fortunately, in this book, if you read the first 3 chapters, you will see that one of the teachers that was in one of Langston Hughes's schools was the sister of C.W. Chestnut, because C.W. Chestnut is from Cleveland. And I think that may be, I think that's in the first 3 sections, but it may be in the section called Central High. So the first 3 sections of this book, you can see, there's a lot of things to discuss. And in the last section called Salvation, he talks about going to church. And this is very relatable to many in the black community. I kind of want to just read this section, but I'm not going to read it. But I just want to make some commentary on it. The Salvation is a story. When I worked at the University of Akron and I was teaching a composition class, I found that every year they were giving students in composition this story to read and write about, because for a multitude of reasons. One reason is because as writing, they wanted people to know that when you're a writer, there's grammar rules are there. However, you need to learn the grammar rules so you can follow grammar rules to communicate a message that you want to send to people in a form that they can understand. However, once you master the grammar rules, you can break the rules. And many writers who break grammar rules to get their point across are poets like Langston Hughes. So if you read this section, you'll see that it's very clear, very understandable, very powerful message. However, he doesn't follow all the grammar rules. But the point I want to make is, I was in the class. I was teaching the class. They gave me the curriculum. They gave me the story to teach to my class, and then I asked the director of composition and those who worked in composition, do you know where this story comes from? You know where this chapter comes from? And they didn't know. So they're sitting there giving everybody stuff, but they didn't know it comes from the autobiography of Langston Hughes. So you have this whole department, this whole English department, supposedly masters in their fields, which is true, they're masters in their fields, but if you step outside their fields of study, they don't know much more than the average person, and they didn't know anything about the autobiography of Langston Hughes, so I informed them. Like, this comes from the autobiography of Langston Hughes, very good book about American history, one of our greatest writers, maybe you should read it. So, but this is a very good chapter. Talks about Langston Hughes going to church, gives a description of the church, the people in the church, which we can still relate to today if you've ever been to a black church. And he feels kind of sad because they were calling him and the young people to come to Jesus. They told you, like, if you feel it, won't you come? Won't you come? And he was waiting to get this feeling that he was supposed to get of Jesus in his life, and he never got the feeling, but he was so stressed about them waiting for him to get the feeling that he just went ahead and went along with the crowd. And then later that evening he feels bad because he lied about feeling Jesus, and he said that he cries. And many people use this section to try to prove that Langston Hughes was an atheist. I don't know much about that, if he is or not, because he, like I said, he doesn't really go into much about himself. But I know that he writes a lot about spirituality and religion and things like that in his poems and in his stories. However, his stories and everything that he writes about relates to the black community. And during this time period, black churches were the cornerstones of the community. So he writes, that night, for the last time in my life but one, for I was a big boy, 12 years old, I cried. I cried in bed alone and couldn't stop. I buried my head under the quilts. My aunt heard me. She woke up and told my uncle I was crying because the Holy Ghost had come into my life and I had seen Jesus. But I was really crying because I couldn't bear to tell her that I had lied, that I had deceived everybody in the church, that I hadn't seen Jesus, and that now I didn't believe there was a Jesus anymore since he didn't come to help me. So that's a very good section of the autobiography. So yes, so read the next 3 or 4 chapters. I'm sure that if you're reading through these chapters or sections, because there's only 3 like chapters or 3 sections of this autobiography, but I'm sure if you're reading these sections that you continue reading. So just read the next 4 sections of the book where he gets into issues between his family, his mother, and his father, and his trip to Mexico is in the next few sections. And I like to talk about his relationship with his father, and he actually has a section where he says, it's called I Hate My Father, and his relationship with his father is very interesting. And then he actually goes to Mexico to visit his father, explains that, comes back home. Then later he actually returns to Mexico, and his father has a certain way of thinking which Langston Hughes doesn't agree with. However, he doesn't say that his father is wrong for the way that he thinks. He just doesn't like the way that his father treats people. So this is Black Literature, Black History. I'm Jason Williams. Read the next 4 chapters of The Big C, and I'll be addressing it in the next video. I know this is getting pretty long, so I'll try to cut it down. Now that we're into it, I won't have to go into the background, but this is Black Literature, Black History. I'm Jason Williams. Have a nice evening.